It's great to welcome to the program today Lewis Raven Wallace, author and creator of The View from Somewhere, a book and podcast about the myth of objectivity in journalism, also co-founder of Press On Southern Media Collective. Thanks for your time during these strange times, I guess I would say.
Yeah, of course.
So, to begin with, I will sometimes get these beautiful emails from people in my audience who say, David, I love that you are not biased in your reporting. And while I will gladly accept any compliment, it concerns me a little bit from a media literacy perspective because I do an opinion program. I am not doing reporting, I'm doing commentary. And the program is very much biased in the sense that it is my opinion, and my opinion is certainly partisan. So, can you start to talk about some of the categorization of media that needs to be done and that maybe not everybody is doing as well as they should?
Yeah, that's such a cool and weird anecdote that really sounds familiar to me, in that I think there's been this sort of bending of the concept of media bias over time to the point that, a lot of us think that biased media is just anything we don't like, right? Or don't agree with, or that doesn't like vibe with us.
Yes.
And so a part of my sort of thesis has been to just get rid of this idea that media bias itself is the problem, and accept that all media in some way is biased, right? We have a frame, we have an ideology, we have a um, not necessarily a partisan political stance, but often that too, that we're bringing to anything that we produce as journalists. And so it's less about trying to be unbiased and more about doing a really rigorous investigation of what our own biases and perspectives are, and being transparent about those. And so it sounds like, the audience members you're hearing from, they trust you,
Yes.
and they might trust you in part because of that transparency. And so overall, that's a good thing. But I think an important sort of shift for us right now is to move away from this conflation of objectivity or nonpartisanship or being non-biased with being trustworthy. Because they are not inherently the same, and I think those concepts have become really muddled in a way that's actually really damaging.
Can you talk a little bit about objectivity versus neutrality, which is sometimes a source of confusion? And the way I've talked about it is I could be neutral on the issue of whether vaccines cause autism, or I could be objective, which is to transparently tell you that all the science tells us that they don't. And that's the way I try to explain it, but there's probably a better umbrella way to talk about that difference.
Yeah, sure. So, I am anti objectivity and neutrality, but I think that there is again a way in which those concepts have been conflated over time, where objectivity might be narrowly understood as sort of what you're talking about, rigorous kind of scientific approach to analyzing the facts in an honest attempt to reflect the closest version of truth that we can come up with, right?
Yes.
Um, but more broadly, it's often been interpreted to also mean that the reporter or the outlet is neutral on the issue, or in some way impartial on the issue, or stands outside of it. In some way. And that's been sort of the journalism school interpretation of objectivity as well for a long time, is that it's a reflection of neutrality. For me, I think even just the idea that there is one objective truth does kind of fall apart, philosophically at a certain point, and leaves us stuck with some of the same issues that neutrality does, of like, how can we ever fully stand outside of something and look at it objectively? And I don't think that that's possible. But I do think that rigor, transparency, being meticulous, being, striving for some version of the truth is something that journalists can and should still embrace, and that we do need to separate that out from some sort of performance of neutrality, a performance of impartiality that has been demanded of many journalists.
Yeah, the performative nature of neutrality is an interesting way to put it. And I think maybe to think about that a little bit, one can visualize the sort of corporate legacy media segments about, for example, climate change, where you have two guests, one of two, meaning 50% represents the scientific view, one of two, 50% represents some other view, right? China created it, it's a hoax or whatever. That is a To me, that's performative neutrality in the sense that it's 50-50 in this very basic sense, but it does not reflect anything about what's actually happening out there in the scientific or factual community. Why has corporate media decided to do that? Is it as simple as avoiding criticism more from one political side than the other, or is there more to it?
So yes, avoiding criticism is one piece. I've heard people say that journalists, for all that we are willing to go after other people, are some of the most thin-skinned um, uh, folks around, which is neither here nor there to me. But I think there are larger forces at play. That has always been true in this sort of performance of objectivity and neutrality, that it originated with a business model based on advertising. So advertisers wanted to appeal to the largest possible sort of general audience, but also often an audience that has money, that has resources, right? So that might have also translated or still translate to mean white, upper middle class audience. And so sort of striking a balance of performed neutrality or performed impartiality that hits right at the middle of that target audience is a priority for advertisers and underwriters and sponsors. That certainly, TV news has taken extremely, extremely seriously this performance. But I also wouldn't underestimate, it's not pure economic forces. There are also political forces, in particular on the right, that have worked very hard for going on 5 decades now to sort of frame the concept of balance in terms of left, right, and then delineate a right-wing perspective that is actually very, very extreme as something normal and normative, and demand that that perspective be represented in quote-unquote balanced media. So the example that you gave about climate change, climate deniers are this tiny, tiny minority, right? Certainly in the scientific community, but also are a minority in the general populace in the United States. And so the demand that they always be represented in a conversation about climate change is a huge win for the sort of corporate right-wing media machine that has pushed to make that happen. And this sort of performance of objectivity, performance of balance, and the demand of that is so dangerous in the hands of demagogues. And that's what we're dealing with now, right? Is journalists sitting around talking about whether or not to say that Donald Trump is lying because it might be perceived as partisan to say that he has lied, when he has lied. And what could be more toxic to the cause of truth than that interpretation or that performance of objectivity? And to have journalists in mainstream newsrooms sitting around having that conversation, which they are, is such a huge win for far right activists who want that to be the debate rather than the truth to be told, and then we debate the real issues from there.
Yeah, as a very brief aside, there's a great book which may not even be in print anymore called Waves of Rancor, which describes a lot of the backstory on how that was built up initially. But so you mentioned this question of, do we say that Donald Trump is lying or do we not? Recently, we've seen CNN doing some sort of live fact checking graphically with notes at the bottom of the screen during the coronavirus press briefings. Can you talk a little bit about the effect that the mainstreaming of the term fake news as sort of as a cudgel has had on journalism and media?
Yeah, sure. So, the mainstreaming of the term fake news and Donald Trump's sort of use of it, as you said, as a cudgel, has been a powerful tool for advancing this sort of warping of the debate, and this demand that every discussion be balanced with both far right ideology, or in some cases now just Donald Trump's ideas, whatever they may be. But that is part of a long-standing tradition, right, in the United States that has always been tied up with racism and white supremacy. And so the example that I give in my book is this idea of the lost cause in the Civil War. And so, the Civil War was, at least in part, about ending slavery, and slavery was a terror on the people who were enslaved, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. But almost immediately after the end of the Civil War, this sort of new story was written about who these white Southerners were who were fighting for the Confederacy and what they were about, and that they weren't about slavery or enslavement at all, but, they just wanted states' rights. And their lost war was this lost cause of states' rights that had nothing to do with racism. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, activists for this sort of lost cause narrative demanded balance in textbooks, right? And demanded that schools, in favor of being less biased, actually teach this story that slavery had been this sort of benign thing, and that it wasn't really what the Civil War was about, and these nice white people just wanted their states' rights, and and they were nice to the black people anyway, and all this kind of BS, right? But that's like the original fake news, like this sort of, it's lost cause, and it's biased to teach it as something that was actually about racism. And so that strategy has been in use by racist demagogues in the United States since forever, and that's just one example of it. Donald Trump is part of a long tradition, and unfortunately has amassed a great deal of power, but he's not the first racist demagogue to amass a lot of power.
Certainly not. Certainly not. So in the limited time we have left, I would love to hear from you. What do you see as the lowest hanging fruit of, if we could start teaching media literacy in 7th grade, which I think would be a great time to start teaching it? 3 things I think would be really useful would be teaching, number 1, understand the primary purpose of a news source, which would very quickly get you to, well, if the primary purpose is to make money, that needs to be included in my analysis. Number 2, understanding whether you're looking at a primary source or not. And then number 3, distinguishing between opinion journalism and news journalism. That's like just an example, and there could be many other examples. What do you see, if you get a classroom of 12-year-olds in front of you, as the lowest hanging fruit that would do the most good as far as media literacy goes?
Those are great. I love your 3 points.
Okay.
I think that my big takeaway, not just for children, but for adults, and this is great if we can start them young, is just curiosity, right? That there's always another question, there's always follow-up. So I think we end up being fed this perception that what you read in the news or what you hear on the news is sort of, that's it. That's the final story. And the myth of objectivity feeds into that. There are these objective people out there who are journalists who just bring you the story, and that's everything that you might need to know. And either you trust them or you don't. But I think all of us right now really need to be working our muscle of curiosity and of always asking more questions and investigating further into things, and essentially sort of become journalists in a way ourselves. Certainly the crisis of COVID-19 and the pandemic has been an opportunity for that. People are seeing in real time how journalistic fact and truth actually isn't set in stone. It changes pretty quickly in an environment where even scientists don't know what this virus is, right? And so all of our ability to be curious and open-minded and to actually change the way that we think about something based on new information and ask new questions over time, to me, that's sort of the core for both people taking in media and for people producing it, is that we can all embody more of that curious journalist or curious scientist, and that a scientist or a journalist, the point of that person is not that they have the best answers, but that they have the best questions. And I think that's often misunderstood.
And process is important, right? Understanding that because something that was said about the virus 6 weeks ago ended up not being true doesn't mean someone was necessarily lying. It could mean that, but we are sort of iterating. Science is an iterative process, so is journalism, and understanding that, because that's also weaponized sometimes to say, hey,
Right.
the thing they told us 6 weeks ago is wrong, therefore Bill Gates is trying to, get a vaccine to sterilize people or whatever. It's all on the table because something was corrected. The process part seems so important.
Yeah, and understanding that process of investigation and inquisitiveness. And I think that's one of the most important things that we could be teaching in terms of media literacy, is that that's all that news is, right? Is the best attempt at providing facts and information of a group of people who brought it to you today.
We've been speaking with Louis Raven Wallace, author and creator of The View from Somewhere, a book and podcast about the myth of objectivity in journalism. So great having you on. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.